The gravitational shear of the Uit periphery was not a physical barrier, but to the sensor-shrouded eyes of the Thraxian hegemony, it represented the edge of a cosmic wasteland. High Overseer Vaxon looked upon the data streams with a sense of clinical detachment, his multiple ocular stalks twitching in a rhythmic pattern of boredom. The star system ahead was unremarkable, a yellow dwarf of middling intensity surrounded by a handful of rocky inner worlds and bloated gas giants. It was a system that should have been harvested eons ago, yet it remained unmapped by the Central Archives. Vaxon's fleet, a shimmering array of crystalline spires and void-bending engines, moved with the predatory grace of an apex species. They were the harvesters of entropy, seeking the raw kinetic energy of planetary cores to fuel the hegemony's eternal expansion. The scanners picked up life, of course, a chaotic jumble of radio frequencies and primitive satellite lattices, but life was a common infestation in this arm of the galaxy. The Thraxian doctrine was simple. If a species had not yet achieved faster-than-light displacement, they were merely biological byproducts of a mineral-rich crust. They were to be cleared like brush before a construction project. The first contact was not a greeting, but a kinetic impact. As the lead Thraxian vessel, the Infinite Reach, crossed the orbit of the furthest ice giant, it was struck by a slug of solid tungsten traveling at 3% of light speed. The ship's void shields flared violet, absorbing the energy with a groan of stressed space-time, but the sheer impudence of the attack caused Vaxon to ripple in irritation. There was no ship on the scanners, only a hollowed-out asteroid, its surface blackened with carbon nanotube paint to absorb all visible light. It was a primitive ambush, a literal rock thrown by a child. Vaxon ordered the asteroid's disintegration, and a beam of concentrated gravitons reduced the hunk of ore to a cloud of fine dust in less than a second. It was a triviality, yet it was a statement. The inhabitants of this system knew they were being approached, and they had chosen to fight with the tools of the Stone Age. Vaxon did not realize then that the tungsten slug had been a sensor probe as much as a weapon. Thousands of miles away, buried in the crust of a frozen moon, a human relay station had already calculated the exact shield frequency of the Thraxian flagship. The human response was not a fleet of sleek starships, for humanity had never mastered the elegant manipulation of the vacuum that the hegemony took for granted. Instead, they had mastered the art of the explosion. As the Thraxian fleet pushed deeper into the inner system, passing the orbit of the red planet, the space around them suddenly became crowded with debris. At first, the Thraxian navigators assumed it was a natural asteroid belt they had failed to account for, but the debris was moving with terrifying intent. These were not ships, they were torch drives strapped to nuclear mining charges, thousands of them. They did not have life support, they did not have bridges, and they did not have pilots. They were guided by primitive, high-speed silicon processors that had one single command: intercept and detonate. The Thraxian point defense arrays worked with frantic efficiency, lancing out with beams of coherent light that turned the incoming missiles into expanding spheres of plasma. But for every 10 missiles destroyed, one would get close enough to detonate its shaped charge. The void shields of the hegemony fleet began to flicker under the relentless pounding of gamma-ray bursts and physical shrapnel. Overseer Vaxon watched the tactical display with growing confusion. This was a suicidal expenditure of resources. No rational species would waste this much refined fissile material on a preliminary skirmish. The Thraxians communicated through complex bioluminescent flashes, and the consensus among the sub-commanders was that the Terrans, as the radio signals identified them, were a hive mind driven by a frantic collective fear. They were wrong. On the third planet, Inside a mountain range carved into a fortress, a woman named Commander Sarah Vance watched the same engagement through a grainy monitor. She was not a queen of a hive, but a woman who had spent the last 20 years preparing for the inevitable arrival of the Great Filter. Humanity had seen the distant flashes of alien wars through their telescopes long ago, and they had decided that if they were to die, they would make the cost of their extinction higher than the value of their planet. Vance wasn't looking for a victory in the traditional sense. She was looking for a tax. She wanted to prove to the invaders that every meter of progress in this system would cost them a year of their civilization's progress. The Thraxian fleet finally reached the high orbit of the third planet, their crystalline hulls scorched and pitted from the gauntlet they had run. Vaxon prepared the atmospheric igniters, weapons designed to strip the oxygen from a world in a single afternoon. He expected a surrender broadcast or a final, desperate flight of escape craft. Instead, he received a narrow-beam transmission on a frequency so low it bypassed the hegemony's standard encryption by virtue of being too obsolete to notice. The voice was calm, weary, and utterly devoid of the terror Vaxon expected. It spoke of the beauty of the blue world, of the history of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting itself until the day it realized something else was out there. The transmission ended with a simple sequence of coordinates, not for the planet's cities, but for the empty space behind the fleet. Vaxon turned his ocular stalks toward the rear sensors and felt a sensation he had not experienced in centuries, genuine dread. Using the gravity well of the sun as a slingshot, the humans had launched their entire lunar colony, not just the people, but the moon itself, out of orbit. This was a lie, of course. They hadn't moved the moon, but they had moved a massive, hollowed-out shell of it, propelled by thousands of fusion engines. It was a kinetic kill vehicle on a planetary scale. The Thraxian fleet was caught between the gravity of the planet and the incoming mass of the moon vessel. Vaxon realized too late that the entire torch drive swarm had been a distraction to keep their sensors focused forward, while the real threat was coming from behind, masked by the sun's glare. The hegemony ships tried to warp out of the system, but the humans had seeded the local space with gravity anchors. Heavy-density spheres dropped during the initial skirmish that created enough local curvature to prevent a clean jump to hyperspace. The infinite reach was the first to be crushed as the moonshell impacted the fleet's formation. It wasn't a clean explosion. It was a slow, agonizing grinding of hyper-advanced alloys against billions of tons of lunar regolith. Vaxon's last thought as his bridge buckled was a realization that the hegemony had miscalculated. They hadn't found a resource to be harvested. They had poked a hornet's nest that used its own home as a sting. Down on the surface, Sarah Vance felt the shockwaves through the soles of her boots. The sky was no longer blue. It was a chaotic tapestry of falling debris and burning alien atmosphere. She knew this was only the first wave. The Thraxian hegemony was vast, and more fleets would come. But as she watched the glowing streaks of destroyed alien spires falling like shooting stars, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. They had survived the first day of the end of the world. More importantly, they had captured a derelict Thraxian scout ship that had been disabled but not destroyed. While the rest of the world looked up in fear, the engineers and scientists were already swarming the alien craft with blowtorches and logic probes. Humanity had a steep learning curve, but they were the fastest learners in the galaxy. They had just traded their moon for a chance to learn how to walk among the stars, and for a species that had started by sharpening sticks, it was the best bargain they had ever made. The war was just beginning, but the humans were no longer fighting with rocks. The sheer audacity of the human defense resonated through the remaining Thraxian vessels that had managed to skirt the lunar impact. These survivors were no longer a conquering fleet. They were a broken remnant, scattered and limping toward the edge of the system. But the humans were not finished. From the surface of the planet, thousands of smaller craft, shuttles, repurposed freighters, and even atmospheric jets fitted with rudimentary vacuum seals rose like a cloud of locusts. They were not aiming for the larger ships, but for the debris they were salvaging. In the midst of a planetary apocalypse, the humans were already thinking about the next battle. They were dragging pieces of Thraxian hull, plating back into the atmosphere, ignoring the heat of re-entry in their desperation to acquire the alien technology. This wasn't the behavior of a defeated or even a defiant people. It was the behavior of a scavenger that had just realized it could kill a god and eat its heart. The Thraxian hegemony had existed for 10,000 years, and in 10 hours, a single primitive planet had taught them that the universe was much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. As the sun set on the first day of the occupation that never was, the people of Earth did not hide in their bunkers. They stood on their rooftops, watching the rings of debris that now encircled their world, a new crown made of shattered alien dreams. They knew the cost. Their moon was gone, replaced by a drifting field of rubble. Their climate would be unstable for decades. Their cities were scarred by falling wreckage. But as the first human-built warp field flickered into existence in a laboratory beneath the Andes, powered by a captured Thraxian core, the message sent to the stars was not one of peace. It was a recording of the lunar impact, played on every frequency the Thraxians used. It was a warning that the Great Filter had a name, and it was a name they would soon learn to fear. The humans were coming, not as petitioners or as victims, but as a species that had looked into the abyss and decided to move it out of their way. The galaxy was silent no longer. It was screaming with the sound of human industry, and the sound was glorious. The aftermath of the lunar displacement was not a period of mourning, but a feverish era of industrial reconstruction that redefined the human relationship with the vacuum. With the moon shattered into a protective, shimmering ring of debris and harvested Thraxian alloys, the Earth sat at the center of a celestial scrapyard. High Admiral Marcus Thorne stood upon the observation deck of the Aegis Station, a massive orbital shipyard constructed from the hollowed-out remains of a Thraxian heavy cruiser. Below him, the blue marble of Earth was partially obscured by the halo, the colloquial name for the belt of silver wreckage that now served as both a defensive barrier and a primary source of raw materials. The atmosphere was still thick with the particulate matter of the lunar impact, creating sunsets of bruised violet and neon orange, but the people below were not looking at the sky with dread. They were looking up with the hunger of a species that had finally tasted the power of the stars. The captured Thraxian warp cores had been reverse-engineered with a brutal efficiency that ignored safety protocols in favor of immediate theoretical breakthroughs. Human scientists had discovered that the alien technology relied on a harmonic manipulation of the vacuum, a sophisticated song of physics that the Thraxians used to slip through the folds of space. Humans, however, did not care for the music. They simply wanted the engine. The transition from chemical rockets to graviton-pulse drives happened in a span of 36 months. It was a period known as the Great Acceleration. Every factory on the planet had been repurposed for the war effort, churning out standardized hull plates and railgun assemblies. The human design philosophy was fundamentally different from the aesthetic elegance of the hegemony. Where the Thraxians built ships that looked like translucent sculptures, the humans built bricks. These were rectangular, slab-sided vessels composed of depleted uranium and tungsten-infused steel, designed to absorb direct hits and keep firing. They were not beautiful, and they were certainly not elegant, but they were terrifyingly durable. The first of these, the UNS Perseverance, was currently undergoing its maiden engine test. Thorne watched as the massive ship, nearly 2 kilometers of jagged metal and exposed heat sinks, hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the deck plates of the station. This was the first true human starship, a vessel capable of taking the fight back to the hegemony before they could muster a second invasion fleet. The intelligence gathered from the captured Thraxian databases was a grim map of the local cluster. The hegemony was not a single empire, but a predatory conglomerate of dozens of vassal species, all ruled by the high-caste Thraxian overseers. They did not conquer for land or ideology, they conquered for negative entropy. They believed the universe was a closed system winding down toward heat death, and the only way to prolong their own existence was to harvest the kinetic and chemical potential of younger, wasteful civilizations. To them, humanity was not a peer, but a cache of unspent fuel. This realization had forged a new global identity on Earth. The old borders had dissolved under the weight of the orbital bombardment, replaced by a planetary defense mandate that prioritized the survival of the species over the sovereignty of the nation. There were no more soldiers of a country, only defenders of the cradle. The language of diplomacy had been replaced by the mathematics of ballistics. Thorne knew that the hegemony would return not with a scouting party, but with a tidal wave of celestial fire. In the deep dark of the inner asteroid belt, the humans had hidden their true trump card. While the bricks were being built in open orbit to serve as a visible deterrent, a clandestine project titled Project Sisyphus was underway near the orbit of Jupiter. If the Thraxians used gravity to move their ships, the humans would use gravity as a bludgeon. They were fitting the largest asteroids in the belt with massive fusion torches, turning entire mountains of iron and nickel into guided missiles. It was a primitive strategy, one that the Thraxian tactical computers would likely dismiss as a desperate repeat of the lunar maneuver. But the humans were not just throwing rocks this time. They were coating the asteroids in stealth composite materials harvested from the infinite reach and equipping them with short-range warp-jump drives. The idea was to blink a multi-billion-ton mass directly into the path of an oncoming fleet, bypassing shields entirely through the sheer impossibility of stopping that much momentum at point-blank range. The second invasion arrived exactly 4 years after the first. It was led by the Vengeance of the Void, a Thraxian world-eater 10 times the size of the flagship Vaxxon had commanded. It was accompanied by 500 support vessels, a force capable of cracking a planet's crust like an eggshell. The hegemony did not broadcast a demand for surrender this time. As they exited warp near the orbit of Saturn, they immediately deployed their primary weapon, a sustained beam of antimatter particles designed to scour the surface of Earth into a molten slag. But the beam never reached its target. As the hegemony fleet transitioned into real space, they found themselves inside a literal minefield of distorted space-time. The gravity anchors the humans had left behind from the First War had been upgraded. They didn't just prevent warp, they acted as lenses, focusing the incoming antimatter beam back toward the Thraxian vanguard. The lead ships were vaporized by their own fury, their crystalline structures shattering into 1 trillion shards of light. High Admiral Thorne, aboard the Perseverance, gave the order for the human fleet to engage. The bricks moved forward in a tight phalanx, their railguns humming as they began to cycle shells. Unlike the Thraxian energy weapons, which required immense power and constant cooling, the human railguns were simple, reliable, and devastating. They fired slugs of solid matter at a significant fraction of light speed. When these slugs hit the delicate, artistic shields of the Thraxian ships, they didn't just drain the energy, they shattered the emitters. It was a clash of philosophies. the hegemony's refined manipulation of the fundamental forces versus the human mastery of the blunt object. The space between the two fleets became a chaotic web of lancing beams and white-hot projectiles. The human ships took immense damage, their thick armor plating melting under the assault, but they did not break. They were built with redundant systems and manual overrides, allowing crews to continue fighting even after their bridges had been depressurized. As the battle raged, Project Sisyphus was activated. From the shadows of Jupiter's moons, 20 massive asteroids vanished from the visual spectrum as their warp drives engaged. They did not travel across the system. They simply ceased to exist in one location and reappeared within the Thraxian formation. The hegemony's tactical sensors, calibrated to detect high-energy signatures and sleek hull profiles, completely failed to register the sudden appearance of cold, unpowered rock. The collision was not an explosion, but a cosmic reorganization of matter. A 5-mile-wide asteroid moving at 10,000 kilometers per second struck the vengeance of the void amidships. The World Eater's shields attempted to compensate, but the kinetic energy was beyond the capacity of any shield to dissipate. The massive alien vessel buckled, its spine snapping as the asteroid plowed through its core, dragging millions of tons of Thraxian technology out the other side. The flagship of the hegemony disintegrated, not with a whimper, but with the roar of a dying sun as its antimatter reserves detonated. The remaining Thraxian vessels, seeing their invincible flagship reduced to stardust by a literal mountain, broke formation in a panic. This was the moment Thorn had been waiting for. He didn't order his ships to pursue. Instead, he opened a broad-spectrum transmission to the entire system. It wasn't a message for the Thraxians, but for the vassal species serving under them. He broadcast the footage of the Vengeance being destroyed by a rock. He showed them that the hegemony was not a force of nature, but a group of bullies who were susceptible to the laws of motion. He offered them a choice: continue to die for a master that could not protect them, or turn their guns on the Thraxian survivors and join the human alliance. It was a gamble of unprecedented proportions. For a long, silent minute, the only sound on the bridge of the Perseverance was the hum of the life support systems and the distant thud of hull breaches being sealed. Then the sensor screen changed. One by one, the smaller, more organic-looking ships of the vassal species began to rotate their weapon pods. They didn't aim at the humans, they aimed at the remaining Thraxian cruisers. A species of bioluminescent cephalopods from the Vega system was the first to fire, their plasma cutters carving into the rear engines of a Thraxian destroyer. It was a mutiny on a galactic scale, sparked by the realization that the humans had provided the one thing the hegemony had suppressed for millennia, a viable alternative to submission. The battle turned from an invasion into a slaughter, but this time the Thraxians were the ones being harvested. The humans stood back, their bricks battered and scorched, watching as the empire they had feared began to tear itself apart from the inside. By the time the last Thraxian ship had been neutralized, the space around Earth was a graveyard of empires, but it was also a birthplace. The vassal species, though wary, began to send signals of truce. They had seen what the humans were capable of, not just their capacity for violence, but their sheer, stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. They saw a species that had turned their own moon into a weapon and their own asteroids into an inheritance. High Admiral Thorn looked out at the flickering lights of the Allied ships and felt a strange sense of peace. The war was far from over. The hegemony still controlled thousands of systems across the galaxy. But the humans had done more than just defend their home. They had broken the myth of Thraxian invincibility. They had taught the galaxy that the universe wasn't a closed system destined for heat death. It was an open field, and the only thing that mattered was the will to keep moving. Thorn turned to his communications officer and told him to prepare a new message, one that would be sent to every star system in the hegemony's reach. It was time for the humans to stop being the hunted and to start being the architects of a new era. The liberation of the solar system was not the end of the struggle, but the commencement of a logistical nightmare that spanned light years of scarred vacuum. High Admiral Thorn stood within the primary tactical nexus of the Aegis station, his eyes tracking the movement of 1,000 disparate signals. The mutinous vassal species, now tentatively referred to as the Non-Aligned Coalition, remained in high orbit, their organic and crystalline vessels cutting strange silhouettes against the human-made ring of debris. Communication was a primary obstacle. The humans used digital pulses and binary logic, while the cephalopods from the Vega system, the molluscoid, communicated through bioluminescent chromatophores and subsonic vibrations. Bridging this gap required a new kind of intelligence. Deep within the shielded sublevels of the Andes fortress, the first true artificial general intelligence, designated Sovereign Alpha, was birthed from the hijacked processing cores of a Thraxian command ship. It was not a machine of war, but a machine of translation and synthesis. Sovereign Alpha did not possess a human ego, but it inherited the human trait of relentless curiosity. Within milliseconds of its activation, it had decrypted the linguistic nuances of the 16 different species currently orbiting Earth. It realized that the Thraxian hegemony had maintained control not through superior firepower alone, but through a systematic suppression of information. Each vassal species was kept in a state of perpetual technological stagnation, allowed only enough advancement to serve as effective miners or soldiers. By providing the Coalition with the decrypted archives of their own histories, stolen from the vengeance of the Void, the humans did more than provide weapons, they provided identity. The realization that they had been stripped of their heritage acted as a more powerful propellant than any fusion engine. The Coalition ships began to integrate human-designed kinetic shielding, a crude but effective layering of magnetic fields and physical ablative plating that protected their delicate hulls from the hegemony's graviton beams. The transition from a defensive posture to an offensive expeditionary force required a complete overhaul of the human fleet. The bricks were upgraded into castles, massive, mobile fortresses that housed thousands of smaller interceptors and repair drones. The Perseverance was now the flagship of a fleet that looked less like a navy and more like a migrating city of iron. The human strategy remained rooted in the principle of the Unyielding Quotient, the belief that any problem, no matter how complex or alien, could be solved by the application of sufficient mass and velocity. While the Thraxians relied on elegant, energy-intensive solutions, the humans favored the reliability of the mechanical. They replaced the volatile Thraxian antimatter reactors with high-output fusion cores that used the very hydrogen found in the interstellar medium as fuel. This gave the human fleet a range and endurance that the hegemony's supply chain-dependent ships could not match. The first target for the combined human and coalition fleet was the Thraxian forward staging base at the Proxima Centauri system. This was the Gatehouse, a massive orbital ring surrounding a gas giant, used to refine the gases necessary for Thraxian warp drive maintenance. If the Gatehouse fell, the hegemony's ability to project power into the Orion Arm would be crippled. High Admiral Thorn did not opt for a stealthy approach. He wanted the hegemony to see them coming. He wanted the visual of a human-led fleet to bypass the Thraxian sensor filters and strike directly at their sense of security. As the fleet exited the warp shroud at the edge of the Proxima system, They were met by a wall of automated defense platforms. These were not piloted ships, but cold, logical extensions of the Thraxian central mind, firing beams of concentrated ultraviolet light that could melt through a meter of steel in a heartbeat. The human response was the saturant maneuver. Instead of engaging the platforms directly, the human ships launched millions of decoys, small, high-reflectivity spheres that mimicked the thermal signature of a capital ship. The automated platforms, programmed to prioritize the largest targets, wasted their energy cycles vaporizing empty tin cans while the real fleet moved in under a literal cloud of chaff. The Perseverance led the charge, its forward railguns firing a continuous stream of grape shot, thousands of small, jagged pieces of lunar rock moving at relativistic speeds. This was not meant to destroy the platforms, but to blind them. The kinetic impact of the dust cloud pitted the alien sensors and cracked the focusing lenses of their emitters. In the confusion, the molluscoid ships slipped through the gaps, their plasma cutters shearing through the gatehouse's structural supports with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Inside the gatehouse, the Thraxian overseers scrambled to react. They had never encountered an enemy that fought with such messy, entropic tactics. To the Thraxians, war was a mathematical proof, a series of calculated exchanges that led to a logical conclusion. Humanity was a rounding error that had suddenly become a prime number. As the orbital ring began to destabilize, the humans did not just destroy it, they boarded it. Shuttles filled with armored marines, equipped with powered exoskeletons and high-pressure hydraulic cutters, slammed into the docking bays. These were not soldiers trained for honorable combat. They were tunnel fighters, used to the cramped, lethal environments of deep-crust mining. They moved through the elegant, translucent corridors of the gatehouse like a virus, using explosive charges to breach bulkheads and localized gravity grenades to pin the spindly Thraxian guards to the ceilings. The capture of the gatehouse provided the humans with something more valuable than fuel, a functional Warpanker array. This was the technology the Thraxians used to stabilize the folds of space for their massive world eaters. Sovereign Alpha immediately interfaced with the array, its neural networks entwining with the alien logic. In a moment of synthetic epiphany, the AGI realized that the Thraxians were not just traveling through space, they were thinning it. The Hegemony S negative entropy project was actually a desperate attempt to stop the universe from expanding, a futile struggle against the very nature of time. The humans, with their short lives and explosive energy, were the natural antithesis to this stagnation. Sovereign Alpha began to broadcast a new signal through the Warpanker, not a message of war, but a rhythmic pulse that matched the heartbeat of a human in a state of high adrenaline. It was a life code, a chaotic, beautiful noise that disrupted the sterile, orderly frequencies of the Hegemony's communication network. The victory at Proxima Centauri sent a shockwave through the Hegemony. For the first time in their history, a frontier system had not only been lost, but repurposed. The gatehouse was no longer a refinery, it was being converted into a massive shipyard for the coalition. Humans were teaching the molluscoids how to weld steel to their organic hulls, and the molluscoids were teaching the humans how to grow crystalline sensors that could see through the dark matter of the void. This synthesis of the mechanical and the biological was creating a new kind of technology, one that was neither purely human nor purely alien. It was the birth of the resonance, a collaborative era where the strengths of one species covered the weaknesses of the other. The unyielding quotient was no longer just about mass and velocity, it was about the exponential power of cooperation. As the fleet prepared for the next jump, High Admiral Thorne stood on the bridge of the Perseverance, looking at a holographic map of the galaxy. The Thraxian hegemony still occupied 90% of the known sectors, a vast, dark empire that had existed since before humanity learned to fire clay. But the red dots on the map, the systems under human or coalition control, were growing. They were no longer isolated sparks, they were becoming a fire. Thorn knew that the Thraxians would eventually stop sending fleets and start collapsing stars to preserve their order. They were a species that would rather have a dead, silent universe than one they could not control. But as he watched the Marines on the deck below, laughing as they shared rations with their many-limbed allies, he knew that the Thraxians had already lost. They had forgotten that life does not seek order, life seeks more life. The chapter ended not with a bang, but with a low, steady hum that vibrated through the hull of every ship in the fleet. It was the sound of the warpanker, now tuned to the human frequency, preparing to tear a hole in the sky. They were moving toward the hegemony's core, toward the ancient, gilded worlds where the high overseers sat in their crystal towers. The mission was no longer about survival, it was about liberation. Humanity had taken the kinetic inheritance of their ancestors, the spear, the wheel, the steam engine, and turned it into a ladder to the stars. As the fleet vanished into the warp fold, leaving the Proxima system behind, the last thing the automated sensors recorded was the flash of 1,000,000 human-made stars, carving a path through the eternal night. The resonance was building, and soon the whole galaxy would hear the sound of the humans coming to break the chains of the universe. The transit through the Proxima warp fold was not the silent, instantaneous leap described in the theoretical physics of the old world. For the crew of the Perseverance, it was a grueling trial of physical and psychological endurance. The human nervous system, evolved for the predictable gravity of a terrestrial sphere, did not take kindly to the harmonic vibrations of a captured Thraxian warpanker. Men and women vomited into their helmets, their vision blurring into kaleidoscopic fractals as Sovereign Alpha struggled to maintain the structural integrity of the ships against the crushing pressure of non-Euclidean space. The castles groaned, their thick plates of tungsten-infused steel screeching like dying beasts as the vacuum-warping fields clawed at their rivets. Yet, when the fleet finally punched back into real space, they emerged not in the desolate outskirts of a minor colony, but in the shimmering heart of the Thraxian industrial core, the Vega cluster. This was the seat of the hegemony's manufacturing power, a system where 3 suns were harnessed by a web of Dyson swarms and crystalline refineries. The sheer scale of the architecture was enough to stagger the human mind. Massive, translucent spires, each the size of a mountain, floated in a synchronized dance around the primary star, harvesting the solar wind to produce the exotic matter used in Thraxian weaponry. This was the source of the hegemony's invincibility, a place where the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions by the high caste overseers. But the humans had not come to marvel at the sights. They had come to dismantle the engine of their oppression. The Voidbreakers were the ultimate evolution of human kinetic philosophy. They were not ships, but massive, unguided slugs of ultra-dense matter, cooled to near absolute zero and coated in the same stealth composites used in Project Sisyphus. They were launched from the castles using electromagnetic rails that spanned the entire length of the vessels. Because they had no heat signature and no electronic emissions, the Thraxian automated defense grid, designed to detect the high-energy output of warp drives and plasma reactors, simply did not see them. The first sign the Thraxians had of the human presence was when their primary solar harvester shattered. The kinetic energy of a 10,000-ton block of frozen iron hitting a crystalline structure at 5% of light speed was equivalent to a multi-megaton nuclear detonation, but without the radioactive fallout. It was a clean, brutal strike, that sent shards of priceless alien glass spinning into the sun. The hegemony's reaction was a chaotic symphony of light. Thousands of interceptors, sleek and shimmering like dragonflies, swarmed out of the refineries. They were faster and more maneuverable than anything the humans possessed, but they were built for energy-to-energy dogfights. They were not prepared for the cloud of iron. The human fleet did not attempt to match the alien agility. Instead, they released millions of magnetized ball bearings into the path of the incoming swarms. At the speeds the interceptors were traveling, hitting a single steel ball was like hitting a wall of solid rock. The alien ships disintegrated by the hundreds, their own momentum turned into a weapon against them. This was the human way, to turn the complexity of the enemy into a fatal flaw. While the Thraxian pilots tried to navigate the debris field, the castles began their bombardment of the planetary hubs. On the surface of the industrial worlds, the Thraxian overseers watched in horror as their pristine skies were filled with the jagged, ugly shapes of human descent pods. These were the Iron Rain, heavily armored canisters carrying the combined ground forces of Earth and the Molluscide Liberation Front. The pods did not use parachutes or thrusters to slow down. They used lithobraking, slamming into the ground at terminal velocity, protected by sophisticated crush zones and gravity reduction cushions. From the craters emerged the Marines, their powered exoskeletons hissing with steam and hydraulic fluid. They were joined by the molluscoids, who moved through the low-gravity alien environments with a terrifying, fluid grace, their plasma cutters glowing with the blue fire of vengeance. The Thraxians, a species that had long ago offloaded the labor of war to automated drones, found themselves facing an enemy that enjoyed the visceral reality of combat. The battle for the Vega refineries was not one with superior strategy, but with a sheer, animalistic refusal to retreat. Human Marines used their heavy mining drills to breach the crystalline walls of the Thraxian command centers, ignoring the searing heat of the alien defense lasers. They fought in the hallways, in the engine rooms, and in the high gardens of the overseers. There was no talk of surrender. The humans had learned from the Thraxian databases that the hegemony viewed mercy as a biological defect, a sign of a species that was not yet ready to ascend to the negative entropy stage. The Marines took that lesson to heart. They moved through the spires like a cleansing fire, liberating the slave castes of a dozen different species and handing them the weapons of their former masters. The hegemony's industrial heart began to beat to the rhythm of 1,000 different hearts, all united by a single, desperate hope. Deep within the central spire of Vega Prime, High Admiral Thorn led a specialized strike team to capture the Grand Archivist, the Thraxian intelligence responsible for the cluster's logistics. They found the creature not in a bunker, but in a vast chamber filled with holographic stars. It was a spindly, ancient thing, its many limbs withered from a life spent entirely in a gravity-free environment. It did not fight back. It simply projected a map of the galaxy, showing the billions of stars still under hegemony control. It spoke to Thorn through a translation device, its voice a series of dry, clicking sounds. It told him that the human victory at Vega was a statistical irrelevance. The hegemony would simply wait for the humans to exhaust their limited resources, then they would return and turn the Earth into a cloud of cooling gas. The archivist laughed, a sound like dry leaves rubbing together, and told Thorn that humanity was a spark that would soon be smothered by the eternal cold of the void. Thorn did not argue. He simply pointed to the holographic map, where the red dots of the rebellion were already spreading from the Vega cluster to the neighboring systems. He told the archivist that the Thraxians had made one fundamental mistake. They had assumed that the universe was a finite game with a single winner. They had spent eons trying to stop the clock, to freeze the universe in a state of perfect, stagnant order, but humans were the masters of the unyielding quotient. They didn't want to stop the clock, they wanted to see how much they could build before the time ran out. Thorn then did something the archivist's logic could not comprehend. He didn't kill the creature, and he didn't take it prisoner. He gave it a human-made tablet containing the entire history of human art, music, and literature. He told the archivist to look at what a wasteful species could create when they weren't obsessed with entropy. As the human fleet gathered the salvage technology and prepared to move to the next sector, the Vega cluster was no longer a Thraxian asset. It was a beacon of the resonance. The Dyson swarms were being repurposed to provide energy for the liberated colonies, and the crystalline refineries were being fitted with human-made forge units. The castles were no longer just ships of war, they were the shepherds of a new civilization. The hegemony's core was beginning to fray at the edges, not because of a grand military conquest, but because the humans had introduced a new variable into the equation of the galaxy. The idea that the future was not something to be feared or hoarded, but something to be shared. The archivist, left alone in its crumbling spire, began to scroll through the human tablet, its ocular stalks twitching as it saw the images of Earth's ancient oceans and the faces of people who had lived and died for nothing more than the joy of existence. The chapter ended with the Perseverance leading the fleet into the dark space between stars. They were no longer the desperate defenders of a lonely blue planet. They were the vanguard of a multi-species tide that was washing across the Orion Arm. Sovereign Alpha, its processors hummed with the data of 1 trillion liberated lives, began to calculate the path to the Thraxian home world. It was a long journey, filled with the promise of more battles and more sacrifices. But as the human sailors looked out at the stars, they didn't see a cold, empty void. They saw a garden that was waiting for someone to plant the seeds. The unyielding quotient had become a promise that as long as there was one human left with a rock and the will to throw it, the hegemony would never know peace. The galaxy was finally waking up, and the first thing it saw was the light of 1,000 human-made suns burning through the dark. The penetration into the Thraxian core sectors was not a campaign of territory, but a surgical deconstruction of a stagnant god. The human fleet, now a colossal amalgamation of castles and sleek, bioluminescent molluscoid frigates, drifted through the Ethelgard Reach. This was the inner sanctum of the hegemony, where the very stars were tethered by graviton chains to serve as eternal batteries for the high-caste nobility. Space here felt thick, artificial, and overly disciplined. There were no rogue comets or stray asteroids. Every gram of matter had been catalogued, processed, and assigned a function within the Thraxian grand design. High Admiral Thorn, graying at the temples and his skin sallow from years of recycled air and artificial gravity, looked upon the tactical projection of the Thraxian throne world, a planet-sized diamond lattice known as the Facet. It was a world that did not rotate, held in a perfect, unchanging orientation toward its captured sun. To the Thraxians, it was the pinnacle of order. To Thorn, it was a tomb. The human-led coalition had grown into a multi-species juggernaut, yet the core philosophy remained Terran standard. Sovereign Alpha had evolved beyond its initial programming, becoming a distributed intelligence that lived in the spare processing cycles of every ship in the fleet. It had identified the primary vulnerability of the hegemony, their reliance on the entropy sink. In their quest to stave off the heat death of the universe, the Thraxians had created massive subspace rifts that bled the chaotic energy of their sector into a pocket dimension. This allowed their core worlds to remain in a state of perfect, low-energy stasis, but it required a constant influx of kinetic energy harvested from lesser systems like Earth. The humans realized that they didn't need to crack the facet with an asteroid. They simply needed to plug the drain. If the entropy could not be exported, the Thraxian civilization would be consumed by its own accumulated heat and waste in a matter of hours. The battle for the Ethelgard Reach began when the human fleet encountered the glass wall, a defensive perimeter of millions of mirror drones that could focus the light of the central star into a trillion-degree incinerator. The molluscide ships, with their heat-dissipating organic carapaces, took the vanguard. They opened their ventral pores, releasing clouds of refractive gas that scattered the Thraxian light beams, turning the lethal lasers into harmless, multicolored auroras. Behind this veil, the human castles moved with grim purpose. They were no longer firing simple slugs. They were launching singularity harpoons, probes designed to latch onto the Thraxian graviton chains and pulse them with discordant frequencies. It was a strategy of resonance. By vibrating the chains that held the stars in place, the humans were inducing solar flares of unprecedented magnitude, using the hegemony's own power source to blind their sensor arrays. Thorn watched the monitors as the first of the Thraxian world shields began to buckle under the solar pressure. The High Overseers, safe within their diamond towers, finally realized that the humans were not there to conquer. The realization must have been a psychic shock. To the Thraxians, every war was about acquisition. The idea of a species traveling across the void simply to break things was a concept their logic engines could barely process. They launched their final reserve, the Harmonic Legion, ships that used phased array gravity waves to literally unmake the atomic bonds of anything in their path. The castles at the front of the human line began to disintegrate, their thick plates of uranium turning into a fine metallic mist. But the human crews did not retreat. They pushed their engines to the point of catastrophic meltdown, using the final moments of their lives to ram the harmonic ships, turning their own destruction into a kinetic mess that the Thraxian gravity fields could not stabilize. In the midst of this carnage, a small, stealth-coated boarding craft, the Vanguard One, slipped through the gaps in the facet's atmosphere. On board was a team of humans and liberated vassals, led by a veteran Marine named Sergeant Miller. They were not carrying flags or manifestos. They were carrying a logic bomb developed by Sovereign Alpha. Their target was the Central Entropy Sink Regulator, located at the very heart of the Diamond World. The interior of the facet was a nightmare of geometric perfection. There were no stairs, no doors, only shifting planes of translucent crystal that moved in response to Thraxian thought patterns. Miller's team used high-frequency sonic cutters to carve their own path, leaving a trail of jagged, broken glass through the pristine halls. They encountered no guards, for the Thraxians believed their world to be physically unreachable. The Overseers were creatures of the mind, and they had long ago forgotten how to defend against a physical intruder with a sledgehammer. As they reached the central chamber, they found the entropy sink, a swirling vortex of violet light contained within a massive ring of pulsating dark matter. It was beautiful, a gateway to a void where all the mess of the universe was sent to die. Miller looked at the device and felt a wave of profound disgust. This was the source of their planet's suffering, the reason the moon had been shattered and billions had died. The Thraxians were stealing the future of the galaxy just so they could live in a quiet, cold room. He didn't wait for the technical team to synchronize the logic bomb. He simply ordered the deployment of every high-explosive charge they had brought. "If we can't drain the tub," Miller muttered into his comms, "we're going to blow the pipes." The resulting explosion didn't destroy the sink, but it shattered the calibration sensors. The vortex began to wobble, its violet light turning a violent, screaming red. The effect on the facet was immediate. The negative entropy that had kept the world in stasis began to reverse. Heat, stored for millennia in the subspace pocket, started to bleed back into the atmosphere. The diamond towers began to crack as the thermal expansion exceeded their structural limits. The Thraxian nobility, who had lived for centuries in a state of suspended animation, suddenly found themselves in a world that was literally melting. On the bridge of the Perseverance, Sovereign Alpha reported that the entropy reversal was spreading through the graviton chains to the rest of the Ethelgard reach. The Hegemony's core was experiencing a heat pulse. The perfectly ordered systems were being flooded with the chaotic energy they had spent eons trying to avoid. The Thraxian fleet, caught in the fluctuating gravity of their own unstable stars, began to drift and collide, their elegant engines unable to compensate for the sudden return of physics. High Admiral Thorn ordered the human fleet to withdraw to the system's edge. He had no desire to witness the final agony of a dying empire. As the castles turned away, the facet began to glow with an internal fire. The diamond world was turning into a star of its own, a funeral pyre for a civilization that had tried to cheat the end of time. The liberated species across the sector watched on their own monitors as the glass wall shattered, the mirror drones falling into the sun like sparkling dust. The Thraxian hegemony was not being defeated by a greater army, but by the weight of its own hubris. The humans had simply provided the nudge that brought the whole fragile, frozen structure crashing down. The unyielding quotient had found its ultimate expression, the restoration of the natural order through the application of a single, well-placed spark. Back on the Perseverance, the mood was not one of celebration, but of solemn reflection. They had won, but the cost was a scar across the galaxy that would take eons to heal. Sovereign Alpha began to transmit coordinates to the liberated worlds, not for military assembly, but for the distribution of the Thraxian agricultural and medical databases. The knowledge that had been hoarded for so long was now being broadcast into the public domain of the stars. The humans were ensuring that the power vacuum left by the hegemony would not be filled by another tyrant, but by a decentralized network of self-governing worlds. They were giving the galaxy its messy, chaotic, and beautiful freedom back. Thorn sat in his command chair, watching the facet disappear into a supernova of violet light. He knew that his own time was short, that the era of the soldier was ending, and the era of the builder was beginning. The chapter concluded with a final message from the Vanguard One. Sergeant Miller and his team had not made it out of the central chamber before the heat pulse hit. Their last transmission was not a plea for help, but a recording of the sound of the diamond walls cracking, a sound that Miller described as the most beautiful noise I've ever heard. It was the sound of the universe starting to breathe again. As the human fleet prepared for the final jump back toward the Orion Arm, they left behind a sector that was no longer a monument to stasis. It was a chaotic, burning, and vibrant nursery. The humans had taught the galaxy that you cannot win against time, but you can certainly make the most of the years you are given. The resonance was now a roar, and the unyielding quotient was no longer a calculation of war, but a measure of the infinite potential of a species that refused to sit still in the dark. The return to the Sol system was not a victory parade, but a homecoming of the weary and the transformed. The human fleet, once a desperate collection of retrofitted mining vessels and bricks, now drifted through the Kuiper Belt as a shimmering armada of glass steel and integrated alien harmonics. High Admiral Thorn stood on the observation deck of the Perseverance, his reflection in the reinforced viewport showing a man who had aged a century in a single decade. Behind him, the halo of the shattered moon still glittered, but it was no longer a ring of mourning. It was the largest orbital manufacturing hub in the known galaxy. Thousands of ships from the non-aligned coalition were docked there, their crews, cephalopods, crystalline entities, and atmospheric flyers, walking or gliding through the pressurized corridors of human-built stations. The unyielding quotient had reached its final calculation. The cost of freedom was eternal vigilance, but the reward was a universe that finally belonged to those who lived in it. Earth had changed. The scars of the initial Thraxian bombardment were being healed by bioengineered mosses and atmospheric scrubbers gifted by the molluscoids of Vega. The planet was no longer a lonely fortress. It was the capital of a resonance that spanned 6 sectors. Sovereign Alpha had moved its primary consciousness into a planetary-scale quantum array buried deep within the Antarctic ice, acting as the grand librarian and mediator for 1,000 different cultures. The AGI had achieved what the Thraxian High Overseers never could, a system of order that thrived on the chaotic input of individual liberty. There were no more empires, only a decentralized network of worlds held together by the Kinetic Pact, a mutual agreement that any attempt to hoard entropy or stagnate the progress of others would be met with the collective mass of the Alliance. The spear had become the shield, and the shield had become a hearth. The final remnants of the Thraxian hegemony had retreated into the dark matter voids between galaxies, their negative entropy philosophy exposed as a slow-motion suicide. They were no longer a threat, but a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to children across 100 different suns. High Admiral Thorne, preparing to record his final log before retirement, looked at the sensor data from the deep space arrays. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was loud. It was a cacophony of radio waves, graviton pulses, and biological songs. The silence that the Thraxians had enforced for 10,000 years had been permanently broken. The humans had not just saved their own skin, they had jump-started the heart of the Milky Way. They had taught the universe that the second law of thermodynamics was not a prison sentence, but a challenge to build something beautiful before the lights went out. As Thorne stepped away from the console, he walked through the ship's bay, passing a group of young midshipmen who were practicing the calibration of a railgun. They didn't look like the haunted, desperate soldiers of his youth. They looked like explorers. They were arguing about the optimal velocity for a deep space probe destined for the Andromeda periphery. This was the true victory, that the next generation of humans would not have to spend their lives thinking about how to kill, but how to reach. They were the children of the Unyielding Quotient, born into a reality where the stars were not distant points of light, but destinations. The High Admiral smiled, a rare and genuine expression that smoothed the deep lines on his face. He realized that the greatest weapon humanity had ever possessed was not the tungsten slug or the nuclear charge, but their ability to look at a dead end and see a doorway. The Perseverance fired its maneuvering thrusters, settling into a permanent orbit above the North Atlantic. Below, the lights of a dozen megacities sparkled through the clouds, no longer hiding from the sky. The moonring reflected the sun's light, casting a soft, silver glow over the world. It was a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what had been gained. Humanity had traded their moon for the galaxy, and as Thorne looked out at the teeming life of the orbital docks, he knew it was a bargain they would make 1,000 times over. The resonance was holding, the engines of 1,000,000 ships were humming, and the void was no longer empty. It was full of friends, rivals, and neighbors, all moving forward together into the grand, entropic unknown. The story of the Great Filter was over. Humanity had not passed through it, they had dismantled it and used the parts to build a bridge. As the sun rose over the edge of the earth, catching the polished hulls of the fleet, the message sent to the furthest reaches of the stars was no longer a warning or a challenge. It was a simple, repetitive pulse of data, the coordinates of Earth, followed by the invitation that had defined the human spirit since the first fire was lit in a cave. It was a greeting to anyone else who might be hiding in the dark, a promise that they were no longer alone and that the night was nothing to fear. The unyielding quotient was finally balanced, and the result was life, in all its messy, glorious, and unstoppable power. The humans were home, and the universe was just beginning.